Hey, what is going on? Coach Eric Bach here, and welcome to the Eric Bach Show, where we help you look great naked without living in the gym. Now, before we jump into today's podcast, we're going to go over TRT Bloodwork, some of the shifts and changes that I've seen in my physiology since starting TRT about 6 months ago. Keep in mind, we have the Black Friday Season of Gains sale going on over at Bach Performance. So if you've not checked that out yet, make sure you are tuned into your email if you are a subscriber, or over on Instagram at Bach Performance. We are breaking down our biggest sale, quite frankly, ever. So you want to take advantage of that right now. Head over to Instagram at Bach Performance. Send me a message with the keyword gains, and I will send you the information on that. Now, jumping right in today. So a lot of people, when it comes to TRT, think that TRT is just about raising testosterone and getting jacked, and that is that. But there are a lot of other things that go into considering going on TRT in the first place, and then what it actually does from a physiological sense. Of course, again, most people think, hey, if you take a bunch of tests, you're just going to get jacked all of a sudden, and that's that. But that is an incomplete picture in terms of what TRT really looks like in terms of being a therapeutic. Yes, suddenly we do have some shifts in terms of tests. We'll go over those specifically. But what I'm going to do now is break down what has changed, where my blood work was before, where it was after TRT over the last 6 months, and then kind of talk about some of the ripple effects and how it's impacted so many different aspects of health, and then give you a couple clear-cut takeaways that you can leverage from this point going forward. All right. So getting started, when it comes to testosterone specifically, my free testosterone went from 24, which is very low in terms of being bioavailable testosterone, to 198. So 190 is kind of like the upper limit of being physiologically, I guess, natural, so to speak. So just barely above that level is where my free testosterone went. And so when we have higher levels of free testosterone, that means our body is able to effectively use the testosterone that is actually through our body. And so what happens a lot of times with the blood work that I see from clients is they might be fine in terms of overall testosterone levels, but their free testosterone is low. And this can be compromised from a number of different things. But if we're looking at blood work specifically, we typically will see an increase in SHBG, which binds up free testosterone and makes it unusable. So if you're getting TRT or if you're getting blood work done to look at things like testosterone, yet you are also not getting your free testosterone level and SHBG, you can have numbers that are within a physiological range where people say you're fine, but you're still symptomatic because your free testosterone is bound up, it is low, and therefore your body cannot effectively use it. So free testosterone for me went up dramatically, again, from about 24 to about 198. So that's pretty significant in terms of a change. Again, just past kind of like the fully natural, I guess, level by about, a couple percent right there. So that was interesting to see. Now, in terms of total testosterone, my levels over the last few years, I broke this down in a previous podcast, which you can check out, had dropped all the way from when I was 25, for example, they're around 940. I had seen them drop to the 600s, 500s, 400s, and then into the mid 300s before deciding to hop on TRT and making a number of different interventions. So in that case, what happened with my total testosterone? So we went from the mid 300s up to 894, right? And so if we're looking at my total testosterone numbers, went from the 300s into the almost 900 range, meaning my testosterone levels went back to where they were, give or take, probably 26, 27, 28 years old, right? And so that's a great spot to be. I feel a lot better. Energy is higher. Sex drive is higher. Physique, I was in great shape before, but I'm definitely, had a little bit leaner, a little bit more size in addition. So those are things to pay attention to. But we've kind of found what we consider the sweet spot, right? So we're still within the physiological normal range when it comes to overall testosterone, and that's really where we want to be. It's not about taking as much testosterone as possible, right? It's about finding that fine balance between what is going to be the optimal dose for where you are while minimizing any downside risk. So subjectively, I feel better energy, recovery, mood, more drive, more ambition, more resilience to stress, which I find to be really important, especially as a dad, especially as somebody with multiple businesses and a very, hectic schedule. So those have been very, very helpful. So the long story short on testosterone, went from low to kind of an optimized level, still within the physiological normal for total testosterone, slightly above for free. And part of that's because we have better blood work in some different areas, meaning my body's more efficiently using the testosterone that we are putting in as well. Now, number 2, estradiol. So estradiol is a blood biomarker that measures estrogen inside of our body. That increased slightly, but not to a problematic position, right? So where a lot of people run into issues is they feel we've got testosterone on one side, we've got estrogen on the other. And so we think, if we take estrogen as low as humanly possible, then we're going to be in a much better spot physically, the way that we feel, the way that we look. That is not the case, right? Estrogen is not the enemy. We still want to have a balanced hormonal profile, not just get rid of things entirely because we view one hormone as masculine and the other one as feminine, right? So if we have too low of estrogen, that can play a role in terms of things like joint health, libido, mood, even metabolism. All of those things can be suppressed if you were just on an aromatase inhibitor that's taking your estrogen basically to the floor, right? So we do not necessarily want to crush estrogen levels. We want to keep everything in balance. And we have threaded that needle specifically in terms of where the estradiol numbers are, very similar to where they were naturally. So my body's been healthy and able to use the testosterone pretty effectively up to this point. Number 3, hematocrit and hemoglobin. So hematocrit and hemoglobin, really what these look at are the number of red blood cells and the thickness of your blood. This is where a lot of the cardiovascular risk comes from being on testosterone, right? And there can be that elevated risk, especially if people are taking super physiological, doses and they're blasting their testosterone 2000 plus. Again, much higher than what I'm currently doing on my TRT protocol and much higher than what most people would do when it comes to using TRT as a therapeutic and not purely as an anabolic. But so with hematocrit and hemoglobin, these are pretty common side effects to see an increase right there. So for example, my hematocrit percentage was around 55. We want that around 51%. And I think it's important to note that for me, I've always had somewhat higher hematocrit and hemoglobin. Talking to my doctors, we believe there's probably somewhat of a genetic predisposition likely to have this being a little bit higher. So it's something that we need to monitor. And so the reason we need to pay attention to this is if your hematocrit gets too high, then we have an increased blood viscosity, right? So if your blood's a little bit thicker, think about that. Thicker blood. If you have high blood pressure as well, or if you have other aspects of cardiovascular risk, obviously that can increase the chances of a cardiovascular event. Now, for me, not much of an issue, but hematocrit is something we're going to want to pay attention to, both in the short term and the long term, especially as we're dialing in initial dosages and trying to find that sweet spot between, optimizing performance and longevity and minimizing the downside risk. So that's something to pay attention to. Now, you can look at doing things like regular lab work and donating blood when appropriate, but that's going to be highly up to the individual and a practitioner. For me, when I give blood, unfortunately, my blood pressure gets pretty low. So again, I kind of mentioned where blood pressure can play a role in this. I typically have very healthy blood pressure, but when I give blood, I feel awful. I have tipped over. I've passed out, multiple times right there. I've got to call the nurses over before the lights go out. So that's not really an enjoyable experience, especially if you get that giant cortisol dump. If you've ever had that feeling, you know what I'm talking about when your body's in full fight or flight mode and you're got the cold sweats, all of that. So we're going to pay attention to really where those numbers progress, especially now that we're at the 6-month mark right here. They are not overly problematic yet to this point. If they were continuing to increase, like if we were increasing the dosage, which is not in the plan, then that's something we'd want to consider and doing some more, donation. Now, also, if you have high ferritin and iron count, which I typically am a little bit higher on those sides as well, then that can be another reason to, potentially look at donating blood. So we're going to continue looking at regular lab work, see if there's any increase, see if things balance out by making a few different interventions in terms of, nutrition protocols, stuff like that, and then that can be beneficial. Now, in addition, and as I was just mentioning with nutritional protocols and interventions for things like hematocrit, one thing we're paying attention to, at my house, I like to use a lot of cast iron. Well, that cast iron can obviously leach in your food. That's great if we need higher iron levels, but I personally don't. My wife does, I don't. So I'm personally cooking more in stainless steel. In addition, foods that are higher in iron, even looking at vitamins, minerals, greens powders, fortified cereals, all of those things, I'm paying attention to what the overall iron load is that I'm taking in, because when that iron load gets higher, that can also play a role, obviously, into hematocrit and hemoglobin. So we want to make sure that those things are dialed in. Now, nutritionally speaking, we can have things like coffee, like tea, that can actually inhibit some of the iron absorption. So you could use something like a coffee rub on a steak, which actually tastes really good, by the way. And then we can also look at things that can reduce the overall absorption rate of iron, such as having calcium with meals. So all that stuff can work pretty well. And those are some of the interventions that we are doing specifically when looking at hematocrit and hemoglobin, because we want to minimize the downside risk of having a heart attack. At 36, not something I'm overly worried about given the rest of my blood work. But again, we're playing the long game here. Number 4, insulin and A1C. So this is really looking at metabolic health, insulin sensitivity. And so what's really interesting is I've never had issues when it comes to insulin sensitivity or A1C. I've been strong, I've been lean, I've had visible abs for 15 years at this point. So that's been a great win. And so my body's very efficient at metabolizing and using the foods that we're putting in. But what actually surprised me is both of these things improved. So this highlights the fact that with testosterone, higher levels of testosterone, yes, we can have better energy regulation. Overall, I'm noticing fewer crashes and slightly improved body composition without massive changes in terms of what I'm doing with my nutrition. And this kind of lends credence to the point that when we improve testosterone levels, we're actually going to improve insulin sensitivity, right? And so that's something that's very important. Now, something that ties in here is when we have improved insulin sensitivity, this means your body is more effectively able to break down and use carbohydrates. We know that carbohydrates are the preferred and optimal fuel when it comes to building lean muscle and, frankly, powering high performance workouts that are going to lead to the biggest changes in terms of body composition. So when you can get leaner, when you have better insulin sensitivity, your actual need for dietary fat, specifically with TRT, is going to be lower. So, for example, with myself and with many of my clients who are on something like TRT, we will typically keep their fat intake 20, 25, really not above 30% because there's not the additional need. So, for example, we use about 20% of the, when we're looking at macros across the board, right? If we're looking at fat, we need about 20% as that foundation. That foundation is really set because having enough fat is what helps us naturally. I mean, we have cholesterol, right? That's a building block directly for testosterone. It can help with some fat-soluble vitamins and minerals and help us absorb those things. But after that 20-ish%, there's not really a physiological benefit to having higher amounts of fat. In your body, yes, it can store the fat as fat. Right? I'm not sure where that whole idea came from. I think that was very popular with the ketogenic diets and the low-fat approaches and some of that stuff or the low-carb approaches that we saw or have seen really over the last 10 to 15 years. That's a completely other story. Long story short, though, because the need for dietary fat is less, specifically when you are on TRT, and if you can become more sensitive to insulin, that means you can have higher carbohydrate intake, perform better workouts because you have a better fuel source, and drive more muscle growth, which we know that carbohydrates are a superior fuel source for. So what does all of this mean? Well, because I want to keep those fats a little bit lower, we're pushing the carbohydrates a bit higher right now based on the blood work, which is allowing me to optimize my training and performance. And again, these are the little details that we pay attention to with our clients. When our clients are getting blood work, and I'm dialing in all these little intricate things in terms of training, nutrition, lifestyle, right? When we actually have data and we have a clear-cut idea of what's happening under the hood, it allows me to be a lot more precise when it comes to helping our guys get into tip-top shape across the board. And that's exactly why we like to get blood work, all of this stuff done directly into our coaching programs. All right, now moving on to the next one, ApoB and LDL. So these are markers that are looking primarily at blood lipids. ApoB measures more or less atherosclerotic buildup in terms of your arteries, right? So this is a much better biomarker than looking at just LDL, HDL, triglycerides when it comes to overall health. Unfortunately, most blood panels do not really look at ApoB. If you go to your doctor, they'll give you triglycerides, local, LDL, HDL, and a few other things, and that's about it. It's very incomplete. ApoB can actually measure when we're starting to have increased atherosclerotic risk and plaque buildup. And so this is a really important number to have. So for me, before I started TRT, I had pretty high ApoB numbers. And this kind of lends to the idea that there's likely a genetic predisposition towards increased cardiovascular risk in my family. That makes sense knowing my family history. So this is something I'm really paying attention to, whether I was on TRT or not. Right. And so those previous levels were about 125, but they dropped down to 100. So a pretty significant decrease in terms of ApoB. So that was fantastic. And given that one of the primary concerns that people have around TRT is increased risk of cardiovascular incidents, right? Well, we're actually improving because metabolically I'm much healthier. And this kind of lends to the idea that, hey, you know what? Maybe TRT was a good idea for my overall health because we're seeing improvements in terms of insulin sensitivity. We saw increased improvements in terms of thyroid. The only negative thing that we've seen up to this point has been a slight increase in terms of hematocrit. Right. So this has been really important. So with the ApoB being at 100, we want to continue trying to get that to track down. We're hoping to get it down to 80. If we can't get it below there, we might look at some pharmacological intervention in terms of helping reduce that just for a long-term cardiovascular risk, given my family history. But this is really important to consider, right? Because if we're putting all the pieces of this together, being on TRT has allowed me to go with a slightly lower fat diet. That has been better for some of the cardiovascular risk factors that I have faced based on what is happening internally with my blood work. And so if we can get to a place where we're keeping testosterone in a healthy place within a physiological kind of normal range without increasing risk, but also improving the cardiovascular risk profile. We can see how TRT here is not just necessarily a PED to get me more jacked and lean. It's actually improving my internal health. And that's primarily what I think most people need to look at TRT for, not something that's just going to get them, completely yoked. And so that's a big consideration. I'm really glad to see that we've made those changes. So we've had a little bit lower fat intake. Consistently, I've been taking fish oil, CoQ10, stuff like that. That's been years really in the making, but just having a little bit more of a focus on a lower fat intake across the board with the help of being on TRT and therefore being able to use a little bit lower fat intake and increasing that carbohydrate intake, that has been beneficial for APOB and my overall blood lipid profile. Finally, CRP and PSA. So CRP looks at overall inflammation in the body. So for me, this has stayed low. Inflammation has really never been an issue. So we're right within a physiological normal range. That's great. Of course, we don't want to have high inflammation, thick blood, and cardiovascular risk markers. That would not be something that we would definitely, we would definitely not want to see that. And then PSA, which is a measurement of prostate health. So this went up very, very slightly. Sometimes that increases with increased testosterone. Hence, men have the propensity for prostate cancer, and that's a big risk factor that we want to look at long term. But that is still within a very healthy range. Nothing really to worry about in that regard. But again, I'm really glad I have these numbers to reflect on, not just from 6 months ago, but again, from the last 10 years of looking at blood work. And so the big picture here is, hopping on TRT for me has made substantial improvements in terms of my internal physiology from an overall metabolic health profile. The only downside that I've seen thus far has been an increase in terms of hematocrit and hemoglobin. And so that's something we're paying attention to. We're hitting a little bit more in terms of zone 2 cardio to make sure that everything is dialed in there. We've actually lowered fat intake, which has improved things like APOB and the overall blood lipid profile that we have. And we're seeing changes in body composition. So beyond what we're seeing in terms of blood health, lipids, thyroid, inflammation, all of that, I'm feeling better. I have more energy. I'm pushing harder. I'm more resilient to stress. I feel like it's making me a better leader, a better father, and improvements in many different areas. And so, kind of breaking all this stuff down, gang, like my goal here is to just, again, be fully transparent with what is changing with me, breaking down how I'm making adjustments in a way that I'm looking, feeling, and performing based on my blood work. Because when I'm working with our clients, very similar, right? I'm not one of these coaches who says, hey, everybody should hop on TRT or everybody should hop on peptides, but I want to be well educated on these therapies. I want to be well educated on what it's like to go through many of them if I do need them, if they're relevant for my health. And I want to be able to provide my clients with a clear-cut data in terms of what's working for their body, what's not, so we can come up with a customized game plan that's going to help them look, feel, and perform their best based on the actual science, not based on conjecture, not based on whatever bullshit we see over on social media. All right. So gang, if you found this one helpful, hey, please do me a favor, drop me a 5-star review, send me a message over on Instagram, drop me a message that says gains, and I will send you all the details for our Black Friday season of gains. That is our biggest sale ever. And gang, that's the last of it from me. I will talk to you soon. Have a great day.